Hello and welcome. Today I'm sharing 5 books that I think if you've ever said, I don't like fantasy, you actually would enjoy. I know a lot of people kind of feel like that maybe they age out of fantasy, that they liked fantasy when they were younger, and then they really kind of have grown out of that. But I would contend that we all need a little bit of fantasy in our life. And if you're someone who typically prefers classics and lit fic, then there actually are fantasy books out there that feel more like classics, but they have this fantasy overlay on them that I just think makes the story more compelling and enjoyable. So, that said, if you have ever said, I don't really like fantasy, I would like you to listen to my description of these 5 books and maybe consider picking one of them up and trying it out and seeing what you think. And I would love to know which one interests you the most. I would love for you to come back after you've read it and let me know what you think. The other thing is, while I've said I have 5 books, I actually have 5 books plus a bonus. So stay till the end to see what my bonus recommendation is as well. Before we get started, I did want to share a little bit around my vision of kind of what parameters I used when coming up with these books to share. So, I didn't want to choose books that are super common. So, for instance, Lord of the Rings is one that you'd think of, where that is a fantasy book that is very popular and one that most people probably have read or at least are familiar with. There also are some very well-known fantasy writers that could be included in this list. You've got, for instance, Robin Hobb or Ursula Le Guin, Patrick Rothfuss. There's a lot of really well-known and well-loved fantasy authors. What I wanted to do here was come up with a list of fantasy books that don't necessarily feel like your typical modern fantasy. Instead, it kind of has this feeling of being from a bygone era, from, being a little bit older, more vintage, more classic feel, and also not have a lot of world building. It feels very close to the world that we're in with some fantastical elements that have been thrown in. And that's kind of my thought here, is to share fantasy that feels a little bit more accessible, specifically to people who say that they don't like fantasy. With that said, let's dive in. The first book I have to share, I think I've mentioned before, and that is Hope Mearley's Lud-in-the-Mist. Lud-in-the-Mist is a pre-Tolkien, it was written in 1926, fantasy novel written by a female author. She wrote 3 novels that were published, and this is probably her most well-known, and it's her only fantasy novel. In this, we have this journey, travel log, somewhat pastoral because there are descriptions of the countryside and the traveling experience as well in this. This is very similar to kind of turn of the century England. It has some, I think, Welsh influences. So in this story, we have outlawed Fey lands. This has happened for a variety of political reasons, but we basically have a land where we've got just regular mundane life, and then we have the Fey lands. In between the Fey lands, we have Lud-in-the-Mist, which is this in-between border town. This town has become a place for smugglers because while the Fey lands are outlawed, their fruit, which is kind of psychedelic, when you eat it, it gives you visions. It's actually caused people to go mad. So it's illegal, but it gets smuggled in just as, a drug would. And Lud-in-the-Mist is right on the forefront of that. We have the mayor of this town, who is Nat Chanticleer. When you first meet him, he seems very rigid. There are rules and ways of life that you're supposed to live, and that's that. But as we get to know Chanticleer, we see that there are nuances about him that make us realize that there are things that he has kind of pushed aside. He's like suppressing about memories that he's had and kind of about his interactions with the Fey lands. As we continue along, it turns out that Nat Chanticleer has a purpose for reevaluating and kind of bringing back up through self-awareness his past history, and also considering a trip into the Feylands, despite the fact that it is illegal. One of the reasons why I would recommend this is this was written in the 1920s. So for those of you who like classics, I think the language and the writing structure will feel familiar, even though there are fantastical elements. While the Fae and this special smuggled fruit are part of this story, it's not overly whimsical with the Fae involvement. It's much more about Nat Chanticleer's character arc and his life and his acceptance of reality. I'm just going to read a little bit from this. On the third day, things began to look different, especially the trees, for instance, of acacias, beeches, and willows, familiar living things forever murmuring their secret to themselves. There were pines, liege oaks, and olives. Inanimate works of art they seemed at first, but as well, they were like an old written tragedy. For if human or superhuman experience and the tragic clash of personality can be expressed by plastic shapes, then one might half believe that these tortured trees had been bent by the wind into the spiritual shape of some old drama. So that is just an example of the writing in this. I think it's lovely. And again, if you've thought, I really don't like fantasy, but you do like classics, then I would suggest giving Lud-in-the-Mist a try. Next, we have a 1940 novel. This is by Frank Baker, and it is Miss Hargraves. So in this, we have Norman. Norman and his friend Henry are kind of goofing around one night, and they end up creating this fictional character, Miss Hargraves, who is an 80-year-old woman. They end up writing this letter to her, and lo and behold, they receive a letter back. And this woman arrives at their doorstep claiming to be Miss Hargraves. So this is someone that they've completely made up, but the description matches, the personality matches, the life story matches, it all matches. She ends up sort of descending upon Norman's life, and he is completely befuddled. I have heard this compared to Frankenstein. I do think that there are definitely elements of this that do match with Frankenstein. You have the creator of Norman and Henry, and kind of what's their responsibility to this, being that they've created. And then you're also kind of wondering, like, is this a fever dream? But it turns out that people in Norman's family also interact with her. And so it's not like she's like his imaginary friend. I'm going to read just a little bit of this. She was looking at me as though she had never seen me before. As though she had never seen me before? Where am I? She murmured, and looking at me as though struggling to remember. Who are you? Why, I said, I'm Norman Huntley. You know me, Miss Hargraves. The words were out of my mouth before I realized what I had said. Escape had been offered to me. I had rejected it. To this day, I always believe that if I had not told her my name then, if I had been hard and denied all knowledge of her, she would never have troubled me again. Without my realizing it, the opportunity had been put into my hands and I had thrown it away. So, fascinating story. I do think it's also thought-provoking. At the end of this book, you're left with a lot of questions and kind of wondering again about the whole plot and how it all played out. So, this very much is a comparable writing style of other books in the 1940s. So if you like British authors and you like that, era of World War II writing and books, then Miss Hargraves might be a good choice for you to pick up. If you choose Miss Hargraves as a book to try, if you don't really like fantasy, but you like Frankenstein and are interested to see what this is about, and after you read it, let me know what you think. I would love to have someone to talk to you about this because I have a lot of thoughts and questions that I would like to discuss. Next, it's hard to suggest fantasy without mentioning Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury is the quintessential sci-fi fantasy author of a bygone era. So the one that I wanted to mention is partially because it's thin, so it's not a big lift for you. So I personally love Ray Bradbury. I have loved Something Wicked This Way Comes. It is kind of a middle grade, but so creepy. The Halloween Tree gives you the whole history of Halloween, which I enjoyed. I also obviously have read and loved Fahrenheit 451. I recently recommended Dandelion Wine for a summer book read. So I love Ray Bradbury. From the Dust Returned is a more modern novel than the other ones I've mentioned. This was published only 25 years ago in 2001. So it doesn't have that same 1960s vibe. It does feel a little bit more modern. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was so creative. The plot moves along so fast that I think you can read through this very quickly. It is less than 200 pages. This is the story of an eternal family. They are sort of, again, this found family group of people that live in this house. We've got a telepath, a vampire, a shapeshifter, and they all live in this house that I think is in Illinois. So kind of like in this place that you wouldn't think that they are. And we also have Timothy. Timothy is the character from the viewpoint that we get in this book. And he is the storyteller of the group. And his job is to kind of make sure that after these creatures are returned to dust, that there is someone to tell their story. It really is this fantastical experience of all of these different kinds of creatures from folklore that we have heard about all living together and kind of the struggles that they have. They end up having this party, which is just so fun. We have a little bit of a love story in here. So this book is under 200 pages. It's not a big ask, and it is, I think, a fun Ray Bradbury to read that while it still has his elements of being very thought-provoking and also very creative, I do think that it is a story and a plot that feels a little bit more recognizable than some of his other stories do. And so you can kind of settle into this idea of all of these fantastical creatures living together in the middle of the United States and what that experience would be like. Just like the others, I'm going to read just a little part of this. The house was a puzzle inside an enigma, inside a mystery, for it encompassed silences, each one different, and beds, each a different size, some having lids. Some ceilings were high enough to allow flights with rests where shadows might hang upside down. The dining room nestled 13 chairs, each numbered 13, so no one would feel left out of the distinction such numbers implied. The chandeliers above were shaped from the tears of souls in tormented sea, 500 years lost, and the basement cellar kept 500 vintage year bins and strange names on the wine tucked therein, and empty cubbies for future visitors who disliked beds or the high ceiling perches. So that is From the Dust Returned. I think that if you haven't read Ray Bradbury, this might be a good place to start. Next, I have A Far Better Thing by H.G. Perry. This book is a pretty close retelling of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I wouldn't even say that it's been inspired by A Tale of Two Cities. I consider this to be a fantasy retelling of it. So before that turns you off completely, I will say H.G. Perry did not modernize the story. She didn't necessarily make it feel, even with the voices that she used, it didn't feel modern. It feels very set in the same time as Dickens. I think she did a fantastic job of taking A Tale of Two Cities and putting a different flair on it that actually can feel somewhat believable. So let me tell you. If you haven't read A Tale of Two Cities, though, I do want to say that I read A Tale of Two Cities at the same time that I read this, and it was a fantastic reading experience. You need to start both of them pretty heavily, where you're, about 7 chapters in to really kind of get settled. And then I think you can start to realize what you need to read of this and then Charles Dickens' work so that you can kind of see the parallels as you go through. but reading them together was a fantastic experience. It really helped me to settle into A Tale of Two Cities and that story. I think I've definitely heard people say that they've tried to get into that and can't. So if you're that person where you've tried A Tale of Two Cities and you really didn't like it, I would try giving A Far Better Thing a try. The other thing is, if you haven't read Dickens, this would be a good entry point. So, the main premise here is that we are set at the backdrop of the French Revolution. We have a lot of spy situations going on, people who are really getting themselves put into jail due to this revolution. So, in this, we have a man who is on trial, and then we have Sidney Carton, who is also in the courtroom at the same time, and they look very similar. It's they're doppelgangers. So, in order for this man to be able to avoid getting thrown into jail, part of Sydney's argument in court is, how could you know that it was actually him when I look so much like him? It could be anyone, right? Like, there are doppelgangers. You can't necessarily hinge your decision on what somebody looks like and saying that that was them, because people look alike. And so H.G. Perry has taken this doppelganger concept and turned it into Fey changelings. So in the English folklore setting, Fae can come in and steal human babies and replace them with fairies, and they become changelings. This is kind of the concept, is that a changeling is a human that has changed into fairy. And so the idea is that Sidney Carton and this man who was on trial, one of them is a changeling. And as we continue on, there actually is this whole political aspect to the Fae world that we are dropped into. We get Sydney's background story and also the changeling story. But again, H.G. Perry fits that concept fully into the Tale of Two Cities. So we still have the same settings, we still have the same murders, we still have the same love stories, all of that in this. I know I had mentioned in Lud-in-the-Mist that we don't necessarily get too involved in the Fae world and Fae politics, but we do in this. And I actually really liked that part. I think it enriched it. I think it also helped to explain a little bit more of the background of the French Revolution. So I thought this was masterful. And if you've ever said, I don't really like fantasy, but you do like Charles Dickens, or you've wanted to read a little bit more Charles Dickens, then I would suggest picking up A Far Better Thing. And if you'd like, also get A Tale of Two Cities and read them both together. If you do that, please let me know, because I loved it. I thought it was such an enriching experience, and I would love to know what you think about it as well. Next on the if you've ever said you don't like fantasy, then I think you should try this book list. I have Tress of the Emerald Sea, and this is by Brandon Sanderson. You really can't talk about fantasy without including Brandon Sanderson. He has 1,000-page tomes that are part of a multiple 1,000-page series. But Tress of the Emerald Sea, I think, is very accessible. I think it's fun and quirky. This is, by Brandon's own admission, a Princess Bride inspired tale. He wrote this as kind of a love story to his wife. They've been married for decades, and you can really feel the love in this, the innocence, the wholesomeness, and you also can see this sort of gender swapped Princess Bride inspiration in this. In this, we have Tress. She is living on an island, and she has fallen in love with the wealthiest family's son. And at some point, he goes missing, and she decides to become a stowaway on a ship to go after him and to save him. Let me read. So, again, because of Princess Bride, this chapter is called The Bride. Tress sat upon her porch, leaning against her mother, and watched the horizon. She held the last cup Charlie had sent. Her lukewarm tea tasted of tears. It wasn't very practical, she whispered to her mother. Love rarely is, her mother replied. A ship appeared on the horizon. I've finally thought of what I should have said. Tress pushed her hair out of her eyes. When he left, I called him a glove. It isn't so bad as it sounds. He just called me one, you see. I've had a year to think about it, and I realized I could have said something more." Her mother squeezed her shoulder as the ship drew inevitably closer. "I should have said," Tress whispered, "that I loved him." While Brandon Sanderson is a fantasy author, I do think that there are actually sci-fi aspects to this. I just think his idea of the sea that the ships are on is just so creative. So if you've heard about Brandon Sanderson, you've always wanted to kind of toe dip in his works, but have been a little bit intimidated because there are a plethora of them, then I would suggest trying Tress of the Emerald Sea. I think it's very accessible. It's a standalone. It is a story that we all recognize in our core, and add to that, it's just fun. Lastly, I have the bonus, which is a Victorian novel. So if you like Victorian literature, if you do like classics and old stories and old writing structures, if you have ever read Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, then I would suggest trying Fantastes by George MacDonald. So I actually have this annotated version because I read it a few years ago for Victober and was really interested in learning about the background behind this. This is said to have been an inspiration to C.S. Lewis, and so I was just really curious to know about the story and about what scholars had learned about it. This feels even more of a fever dream than Miss Hargraves does. When you're reading this, you're thinking, is this guy asleep? Is he sick? What is going on? And in addition to Lud-in-the-Mist, it's also a travel log journey type of a book. So we have a young man who, on his birthday of changing from a boy into a man, he ends up traveling to a fantasy world, and we just kind of plot along. There's a couple threads connecting it, but each chapter also feels a little bit like its own story that you could just read. The language is very much of the Victorian era, and while it is a fantasy story, it definitely has that literature feel to it. Also, a lot of the George MacDonalds that I have read are middle grade. This is not middle grade. This could be YA because, again, he's transitioning from child into a young man. But I think because of the complexity of the plot and the language and writing structure, I do think that this very much is an adult novel. As soon as I looked out of the window, a gush of wonderment and longing flowed over my soul like the tide of a great sea. Fairyland lay before me and drew me towards it with an irresistible attraction. The trees bathed their great heads in the waves of the morning, while their roots were planted deep in gloom, save where on the borders of the sunshine broke against their stems, or swept in long streams through their avenues, washing with brighter hue all the leaves over which it flowed, revealing the rich brown of the decayed leaves and fallen pine cones in motionless rivers of light. Beautiful. This is not a fast read. It's definitely something that you will want to take your time with, but I really think that if you like Victorian literature and you're not sure how you feel about fantasy, this is a great marrying of both that I think will leave a really good taste in your mouth for the fantasy genre. All right, so there you have it. 5 plus a bonus fantasy books that if you've ever said, I really don't like fantasy, I would recommend you try. Let me know in the comments below what has interested you. Let me know if you've read any of them. I would love to know what you think. If you do read them, I love to encourage everyone to try the fantasy genre. It's one of my favorites, and I think just such a beautiful place for creativity and imagination. So as always, you guys, thanks so much for watching, and until next time.